We welcome you. We're delighted tonight to be doing an evening occasioned by the publication in paperback of EJ Koh's extraordinary memoir, The Magical Language of Others, first published a year ago. And we'll talk a little, we've been chatting, and as some of you have come in on the chat, about some of the circumstances, because we in what feels like years ago, but it was actually January of 2020, a little more, just a year ago this month, EJ launched this book in hardcover in person. That's the part that makes it seem years ago. And it was a conversation she had with Rich White of The Stranger, who had written a wonderful profile of her and this book. So that was that reality. And with her tonight, we're delighted to again, because we actually got to finally do an evening with her for her own new book, Cathy Park Hong, who I'll say a little more about her work in general, but she's also written poetry. But this book, Minor Feelings, which was published last spring, and that came out at a time when another part of the reality we were in, where we had originally set up as a physical in-person reading, and it became apparent that wasn't going to happen then. But that was also when we thought, maybe in 3 weeks this will all be over, because they kept giving those little shifting dates. It never did happen that way yet, but we had a wonderful evening with her for this book, which has just had an amazing life. And I haven't even told her that my job in the bookstore for a few months was just simply mailing out internet orders, but this book was so given as a graduation gift. I kept gift wrapping, especially and writing the enclosure card about graduation book, because what it said of being, it's a personal book, memoir, but it also looks at larger issues of being an Asian American in this country in this day, and with a resonance for younger, for older, and all. So the two of them you will hear from tonight. And one of the other things I'll say at the outset too, these are two writers who are first and still should be known as poets, excellent poets at that. EJ Koh first read at Elliott Bay in terms of her book. Actually, I'll say something about her first reading in a second here at Elliott Bay, was A Lesser Love, a wonderful book published by Pleiades imprint, which is connected to Louisiana State University Press. And with Cathy, she's got 3 collections out, the most recent of which, Engine Empire. Wonderful work each of them has done. EJ, the timing of tonight also, besides marking that it's EJ just having had this book come out in paperback, reminds us, as we're in this now the 3rd day of a different political era and different public language that's we're in and about. It was 4 years and 2 months ago, 4 days after the election day, 2016, that we had a reading at Elliott Bay that was already scheduled, and it was actually Sherman Alexie kind of hosting 2 younger poets. And at that point, EJ's book had not been published. So her, I think, sort of first reading at Elliott Bay that way was this huge crowd that showed up. I think it was people needing and wanting to be around each other in a way we could be each other with each other, and also knowing, even in advance of what we were about to go through, that we needed good, important, a real language, poetic language. And EJ in particular, of the 3 that night, sort of, I think, blew people away what she quietly and powerfully did with her poetry. So that's a little spin of time that spanned with EJ and Elliott Bay. EJ's book, Magical Language of Others, is a memoir that, as you probably tonight, the questions will be informed by people who've read the book, is a book talking about what happened in her family, most notably her parents going back to South Korea to work and leaving her and her brother here in the US, and how they navigated that. And it's marked especially by a remarkable series of letters from EJ's mother, and which the book, in both the paperback and hardcover, includes some of the letters in Korean, and EJ does translation and explains what's going on in the letters. It's a powerful book of cultural adaptation from between here, or cultural going back and forth between here and there, as well as the physical part, and just coming to know herself and growing up through this. It's a book that I have a colleague who actually can't read this because she's also of that same background, and just feels it's too emotional. It's a very powerful book that way. But AJ does a beautiful work of taking you into what was some painful time, but also bringing you through it. And as again, only really good writers can do. So they will, you'll hear EJ read, and you'll hear the two of them converse. And then as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or also you'll get information if Karen's been putting some of it, she'll put it again on their books. And then Cathy will ask the questions, and then I think my colleague Karen will probably be the one to come back and close this all up. We are so grateful you are all here, and we know it's going to be an amazing, wonderful night. And we thank both Cathy Park Hong and EJ Koh for their part in this and in the books themselves that they've written. So on that, thank you all again, and now please welcome and give good, kind attention to EJ Koh and Cathy Park Hong. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for that generous introduction. Wow, and really personal. And I've known you for quite a while now, and so I'm really grateful for getting any chance to see you and meet you again. But Cathy, thank you for being here tonight. It's pretty late over there, so we'll get this going. I'm reading something pretty short, and I have questions I want to ask you too. I'm just so glad to have the chance to be with you. So quick reading here. It's this is from a passage from the chapter with uh, my paternal grandmother Kumiko, and it's the one where they're in Jeju Island. And uh, normally I would ask if anybody has heard of Jeju Island, but in popular sort of American culture, you might have heard of it through Henmyo, which is sea diving women or sea women, I've heard them referred to. So what's really interesting about Jeju is they're different from other, from mainland Korean culture and other sort of Asian cultures because it was it was a matriarchal society, and you'd have the women sort of doing the trade and then bringing in the bounty and selling and whatnot. So it's really, if you're interested in learning more about Jeju Island, but this scene I think I read for one of the first times earlier this week with Alex, so I'm still getting used to trying to read it, but it's during a US backed suppression campaign that happened on this island, and it resulted in a massacre of civilians, children, men, and women. And my grandmother, Kumiko, at the time, went into the mountain with her mother and father to hide. And while they were in the mountain, Kumiko's mother sort of reprimanded her father and said, "You need to go down this mountain. You need to check on our friends and family." And Kumiko begged him not to go, but he went, and they've been in the mountain a few days, and now they haven't heard back from Kumiko's father, and they're about to come down the mountain. Rocking back and forth, Kumiko thought back to the long afternoons, algae cresting the sea's surface, buoys attached to the girls' waists. Jeju was an island in abundance of rocks, wind, and women. You could go in any direction, and you would find only these three things. Now, whether she faced north or south, east or west, there was only fire. When Kumiko and her mother came down the mountain, the island was scorched. They passed through burnt villages, their voices lodged in their throats. Many of the dead could not be found, their bodies tossed over cliffs, hidden away in caves, or chopped into bits, signs of covering up. Mothers cupped the air with their hands, holding the missing faces of their husbands and sons. Their wailing and screaming filled the hearts of all who sifted through the remains. Teeth, hair, dead horses and pigs, then mosquitoes. The smoke reddened the sun. They covered their mouths, or they would taste the corpses. There were children, the girls Kumiko played with, and women and men lying with limbs bent over each other, splayed across the road, tens of thousands of them, idle along collapsed terraces where the islanders once danced, pumping with life. It was Kumiko who crossed the road over a bridge and came to a part of the ground soaked in blood. When she asked after her father, somebody pointed to this ground. She saw nothing except the many faces around her, mouths wide and sullen. One islander, a grandmother, said to her, "Your father was captured at the bottom of the mountain and dragged into a demonstration." She explained that a demonstration was a public display. A group of men, unfed and irate, corralled a crowd together. They put on such displays on behalf of the country and on higher orders for going restraint. What evil was born out of demonstrations? Then where is he? Kumiko asked. The grandmother opened her palm toward the ground. Here, looking closer, flesh and bone, gristle mistaken for bark and debris between the stones. At once, the road became vivid, and Kumiko recognized her father. Road, father, road. They stoned him until he was gravel, the grandmother said, as though she were not speaking to Kumiko, but a deity who had come down from the mountain to judge her for the truth. Many of us stoned him to prove our innocence. We stoned our own again and again. They stoned him over nights. They pitched blunt rocks harder over days for sport until finally boredom before the body was pulverized. What was exchanged between the police and the groups of men and the islanders, between the rocks and the bones, between the body and the road? What was supposed to be understood? Though they did not know it, the days that Kumiko and her mother spent hiding on the mountain were given a name. Such were the questions raised by the Jeju Island Massacre of April 3rd, 1948. Thank you. Ooh.
Thank you, EJ. I felt like I had to allow for a pocket of silence because that is such a devastating, piercing passage. Um, and it really hits me. But whew.
My hand is shaking.
Oh my God,
I'm not
that's
used to reading past.
powerful.
I was like,
That's
oh
so
yeah,
powerful.
gotta get through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, I have to say that I'm really happy to have this conversation with you because I read, um, I have the hardcover, The Magical Language of Others, close to actually when it came out. And, I ripped through it and I just thought that your prose, I mean, definitely you could, there was a real poetic sensibility to it. And the prose was just so precise and pristine, and it's saying with such wisdom and sorrow, and yet it also just captured so many of these historical violent moments, without looking away. And I thought, and I really admired that uh, this book for that. I also found, because I'm a second generation Korean, I found the stories to be very authentic and recognizable too. And also it's and brave. I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but this book, the center of this book is about your mother, and you know, mother for me, the mother is kind of this uh, iconic subject matter that writers are gravitate towards, and I'm always scared away. I get scared when I even think about approaching the subject of of mothers. But I think your relationship with your mother is, you approach it as a memoir, and for that reason, it's because of the genre, it's very intimate, and personal and vulnerable. But also, what makes it even more intimate and personal and vulnerable is that you actually incorporate your mother's letters in here, which kind of act as these kind of chapter um, dividers. And I guess my first question is, this. I'm assuming you began the book by. I mean, you say you began the book by translating your mother's letters. You found your mother's letters and you translated your mother's letter. I was wondering, in the process of translating them, what did you discover about them? What, like, sort of subtext or hidden meaning um, behind the voice did you discover about the letters, and how did that inform the writing of this book?
Right. That's a that's a great question. And
Hmm.
I want to respond to all the lovely things you said too. I remember reading your book uh,
Hmm.
as soon as it came out. And there's this line in Minor Feelings where you say, I couldn't, something like, you couldn't write about your mom because if you did, it would just eat the whole book. It would just
Yeah.
digest and swallow the book. And I remember laughing and thinking, this is so true that if you wanted to write this book, you couldn't have talked about your mother. And it's interesting. It made me, and my book had just come out at this same time, so it made me think, going forward, what is that book without my mother? What does that book look like? And
Hmm.
it would be completely different. Even the writing, the style, the language, it would, because my mom is seeped into every sort of choice. But
Hmm.
oh, I think that's the first time I've gotten that question about sort of subtext and my process of translating the letters and what I saw. When I first found the letters, I had met with Don Mee Choi, and she's a poet, and poet translator in Seattle. Met with
Hmm.
her in the park. It's pouring rain. And I said, I don't know what to do. I need your help. And it's funny because she said, well, it's so obvious. You have to translate these letters. You have to read them. And so I took them to New Hampshire. I took them to McDowell, and they,
Hmm.
pictured this cabin, no Wi-Fi, no outside contact. And I was sitting at it's like a little cabin studio at the desk, translating and many times reading the lines for the first time. And I noticed that, hmm, I think when I first read the letters when I was a teenager and I was in Davis, I remember I could only sort of read them out loud and sound them word by word by word. And I took them sort of as I could hear them. And that was all I could take. And even that was not enough. It felt like I need more from this letter and I don't know how to pull out more. And I don't. want to deal with this, and so I put them away. But translating the letters in that cabin, um, because I'm reading and forming the sentences, it made me sort of look at her double meanings and look at sort of the shape of her letters, how she would have these scenes that open up about her day and about the things she's learning about penguins and whatnot, or referring to, I think she goes to this Whitney Houston concert in one of them. And I think the second time I noticed how much joy there is in her letters. And I know that's a word we use a lot, but just like brave. But
Mhm.
her letters are so positive and uplifting, and it was so different from what I was going through at the time. The contrast was so so vivid to me, and maybe that's what made it more heartbreaking to read versus if that contrast wasn't so big. It's almost like not only were we on different sides of the world, of the planet, we were also living completely different lives and different perspectives. And that made the distance that was already so fraught and painful feel heavier. And
Mhm.
so when I translated the second time and I was going in to put in the prose chapter, sort of the exposition of my life, it it was tough to put them side by side, I would say.
Mhm.
Not the translation, but writing next to those letters, it felt like they were really pushing against each other. And at the same time, I thought that was a truthful representation of
Mhm.
how it was.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, reading it, I definitely noticed that contrast between like the kind of hurt and loneliness that you were going through, and the very upbeat, positive tone of the letters. And but in reading them, I also have to say there was, there's this quote in the book where your mother says, you must be my mommy to make me happy. You must be my mommy to make me happy. And I just thought there was also something very childlike about these letters and this like need for reassurance, that if you're happy, I'll be happy. Like she needed to hear that you were happy so she could be happy. And it was like there was almost this imposition of positivity in the letters, and so that was what struck me. Like the kind of subtext is like kind of buried guilt in her letters as well.
It,
Um,
there,
and
yeah, even there's one place where she talks about reading a book about how to age with grace, and she's saying, "I want to age with grace, and I want your help. I need your help to become a better mommy." And
yeah,
yeah, yeah, I think going through her childhood and what her life was like as a daughter, it took me a long time to realize that she's
mhm,
not just my mom. She's also a daughter who's been separated from her mom, and she's still looking for her. So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like when your mother is, there's like when you're growing up, your mother is your mother, and it's like they're either all powerful or you feel betrayed by them, and they're like these authority figures who didn't do their job, or they did. But then when you definitely see as you get older, you see the child that they were, you know, and so there is this kind of sympathy to it, and you do that right by going into the history of your mother's history and your father's history through the stories of their own parents. And one of the kind of thematic strains is abandonment, right? Like the way you felt abandoned, and then the way your mother probably felt abandoned through her own mother, Chun, who left the family for a while. So you see also this kind of cyclical, this recurring um, trauma that's happening throughout the book. Um, I was just wondering, I was also, and then of course there's this story of your father's mother in Jeju, which is just absolutely just so devastating, you know, and that is also kind of abandonment because he left to go down the mountain and he was stoned. Um, I was wondering about the research process of your book. How you found these stories, how you went back and revisited these stories now. Um, because some parts of, I would say, especially with the story of your grandmother Chun, it's really this her story is really quite personal and very vulnerable, and so I was wondering what that involved. Hmm.
For my mother's parents' story, so Jun and Lee, they're, or Chun, you could say it either way. And I think I've been listening to that story since maybe even before I could speak because I spoke so late. So my mom's been telling me that story all the time, and it always ended up being a bedtime story for me, almost right before bed. And the lessons would change. The story is the same, but different parts of the story would give different lessons. Like, that's why you don't do this or you die, or that's why you don't invest in this thing or this happens. And so it was a repetitive story, almost with a certain beat and rhythm that stayed with me, stayed in my body. And I think I started to realize, oh, this is her trauma, and she sort of, this story is the sort of root of trauma because she's constantly repeating it and she's constantly saying it again and again, and it's solidifying that feeling within her and also keeping it alive.
Hmm.
And I remember it would almost, even if it wasn't bedtime, I mean, this is so many of our, like, up to the age of 14, every night, but sometimes they'll just leak out almost. We're arguing or something, and it's like, you're just like my dad because blah 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 blah. Or we're driving, and my mom would have loved this kind of day because she likes rain, because rain makes everything clean. And so it's almost like the story, the facts and the history was constantly coming out of my mother. It was constantly emanating, and it was embedded in our bodies, in the objects, in even the plates she chooses. It was everywhere. And for me, it was gathering all those things together, assembling them, and starting with the objects. I remember the socks the most. For me, I always remember the socks because my mother tells me about her scissor cutting the socks so that her mom will repair them to sort of trick her mom to come back home. And it wasn't until after I reunited with my parents, my mom's still telling that story, but she'll have little insights and say, my mom must have known. She must have known I cut them myself. There's no way, she thought, look at all these perfectly cut holes, and my daughter is wearing all her socks out. All the sort of pots and pans are broken on their own. So um, being with her, I mean, that's being as close to the story as possible was helpful. I know that's quite long, but oral history and research is definitely helpful. Making really good friends with librarians, like the Korea specific librarian at University of Washington, that's really helpful because they're going to help you get records in places where it seems there are no records and it's impossible to get records, but they might be able to get you photographs. Or I needed to see what a bus looked like in 1970s from Daejeon to Seoul. So it's a sort of collection of whatever I can um, live in, be with. And same with, I think similar with the Jeju story and the Kanto too. There's the Kanto massacre with Kumiko's parents, and then the Jeju massacre, um, which is just remarkable, and everything in between. But with that, it was a lot more methodical because by then I was able to sort of locate more concretely and I should say this ahead of time, I'm looking at histories that triangulate from US, Japan, and Korea. So it's helpful to have those languages. It's helpful to try to look at a certain event from each of those points on the triangle and then decide that you're in the center and you have to bring the emotional truths in. The history is going to have the statements, they might have the dates, but they're not going to have the things that actually make it into the book. For me, that was the case. So my grandmother's story, I had to first almost draw out a timeline and locate her at this age. She would be in this city in Japan at this time. And this is, and I know for sure that at 19, her parents tell her that she's Korean and not Japanese, that they were hiding the whole time. So things, the things I kind of start out with are more robust in that way with my grandmother Kumiko, but it's tough because all the living survivors of those events, they're not here, they're not alive anymore, and there's not a lot of official records, and there's still things about the Jeju uprising and massacre that we're still learning about. We're still uncovering those sites of burials. So it was a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's the Jeju Massacre is a historical moment that very few people, I mean, especially Americans, know little about. I mean, I didn't learn about it until much more recently, but it's also very typical of the kind of history where it's just this convergence of colonial powers. This time being where South Koreans were rooting out anti-communist, anti-communist Korean government rooting out people who they were leftists, and then this massacre happened. This is like a question that I too get asked, and I'm gonna throw it at you because I feel like I'm always I'm grappling with it. And you might also get it too, which is how do you negotiate writing the truth and not hurting the loved ones you're writing about in nonfiction? Um, how Because this book is so much about your mother who's still living, and and I'm sure if it's from the parents, Korean parents, I mean, it's already like you're going to write a book about them. There's this, if you're going to write a book about any family member, the family member is always going to be scared that you're going to talk shit about them. Uh, but Korean parents, I'm sure there's this expectation that you're going to write about them. If you're going to write about them, it is to honor them. But then, of course, to honor them is to obfuscate, to hide. So, how did you negotiate that sort of truth telling, and also, the boundaries you may face when you're writing about a loved one?
Right. Oh my God, I would love to know your answer too. I would love to.
I don't have an answer, so I'm asking you.
I would love to know your answer too. This it's tough. I feel like I have a few different answers to this, and that might be the case for a lot of questions. That the answer is not one thing. It's also growing and it's changing as the book is out for longer and longer. And but I think initially when I was setting out to, my mom knew I was translating the letters, and they were, I mean, everybody knew I was working on this memoir after that, but I think I'm fortunate in that I got a lot of space because I suspect it's because we had done such terrible things to one another that writing a book didn't seem too bad at first. And of all the things we have done to each other's lives, and out of all the pain, I think they thought, oh, I'm gonna write some stories. Oh, sure. And when it became a little, when my mom's friends, for instance, start bringing up the book, or you hear about it a little more um, in their sort of community circles. I don't know. I think it was they they weren't they didn't respond as much as I thought they would to the parts about them, to the parts about our family's history. They actually responded the most to the parts about me and to the parts about my childhood, because they had, I think what breaks the heart sometimes is that my heart's beating so fast, is that they didn't know. And I
Mm,
think that can be even more painful sometimes is, well, I didn't know. And if I had known, maybe things would have been different. So I think Claire Dieder, or another amazing writer, talks about this, but she says when she was writing her memoir, the people that she was worried about what before the memoir came out ended up being not the people that actually were worried about the memoir once it did come out. And I found that true. I worried about my mother and especially, my brother and so on. But after it came out, everyone was more worried about me. So I'm lucky in that they've been generous. But I want to hear how your experience has been, Cathy. I'd love to know.
Um,
Mm.
I am also lucky because my parents can't speak English. No, no, but I don't really write about my family in the same way that you do. I mean, I do write certain passages, but then I also write about friends, of course, and I don't, but I think that's very poignant. What you're saying is that it would make sense that your loved ones would feel more pain just reading about what you're going through because, you're not going to be revealing um, what you're going through. And even though I didn't get it from my family per se, it was from other people I went to school with and childhood friends are like, I didn't, I didn't realize you were going through. I had no idea that that was going. You hid that so well, and I was like, well, you never asked, you know. But so it was, I think the focus was like you. The focus was more on what I was going through. But it is a question that I think about often, and I personally think that um, perhaps I do wonder if you were to write as truthfully as you can, maybe there is a little bit of betrayal in it. There is a little bit of cruelty in it, um, which is why people say not to marry a writer. You know, I don't know. I mean, it's a boundary that I'm always constantly kind of negotiating myself. When you write autobiographically, and I mean, this is a question that all autobiographical writers go through all the time. I mean, it also, there's another part, and this is actually going to be my last question because I realize it's 9:46 and
Oh,
we need to go to,
forever.
there are already some questions in the chat box, but this is connected, and I was thinking about that. The reason why I was thinking about the question was there's a passage where you're talking to Joe Wenderos, Joe, sorry, I didn't mean to give away. I thought that was the poet, where he was looking at your poems, and his criticism was that there was no magnanimity. I can never pronounce this word. Magnanimity, magnanimous. That they're not magnanimous, and I was wondering, and this is kind of a very broad and abstract question, and you could answer it however you want, but do you think you have to forgive your subject matter in order to write truthfully about them? Because this forgiveness is also a theme that runs throughout your book.
I think what I learned from my, I think poetry is my first language.
Mhm,
It was the language that I could finally
mhm,
speak in. But like that first week when I was writing poems, I mean, I wrote so many. It was my first class out of
mhm,
leaving my hip hop dance crew life, and I wrote like 40 poems that week. And I remember my teacher telling me, just, you can really start so many poems and you can fill them up in the middle, but you really have trouble ending your poems. It's almost like you never get to the turn at the end. And so these poems were about my family and mostly my mother, but I think it was my advisor in undergrad at UCI that told me that by the end of the poem, you have to forgive your mother, or if you don't, the poem has to forgive you for not. There has to be some greater understanding and relationship to this poem. Otherwise, it's a diary, it's a journal entry, it's anything else. And so, what's incredible is that I took that lesson and I ended up putting it in all aspects of my life, not just with poems and poetry, but how I deal with how I have relationships with people, and that was really startling. I think I didn't know how to care about um, my relationships. I didn't know how to express uh, simple gratitude. I didn't know how to sort of uh, do any of that. I didn't, and so I had to learn from the beginning. And I think poetry taught me how to do that. It was writing the poem helped me do that, but also it came out in other parts of my life. So by the time I got to this memoir, I thought the very, the beginning drafts were so full of rage and full of anger, and that can be really productive. But I just found it really one tone throughout those first drafts. It was kind of boring for me to read, and it's probably boring for anybody else to read. And for me, I didn't know what I got out of it. I mean, how much had I changed by writing this? Um, Really, I should be looking at what I want to do, and the book is sort of the aftermath. It is the sort of result of my work on my past and my family's past. So revision after revision, it was an opportunity to get to the turn in these sort of passages. I remember I was watching one of your interviews, and I think you mentioned that minor feelings came out of you were writing them almost like stanzas of all these pieces, and then they came together. And I just love that because I feel similar. I feel
Mhm.
like I was writing memoir, but I was writing poetry for parts of this, maybe most of it. And so those little things came in where I thought, what is the thing? Maybe I need to forgive, but if I can't forgive, what can this passage do to show me that I haven't done that? That's missing, and maybe that's silence, maybe that's space, and so it's been really helpful to think of it that way.
Mhm. Thank you. I I mean, that's a really strong message to carry with you, and I agree. And I think you can still forgive and yet be angry too, because it gives allows some distance to that anger. What was it that he said? He's like, if you can't forgive, you have to forgive the poem.
It's like if
Um,
you can't forgive your mother by the end of the poem has to forgive you for not being able to do that.
okay.
I find that interesting. And I've gotten this question before. It's really interesting. They said, so you don't feel any pain or any anger about anything. You've completely forgiven. And I thought, oh, you could forgive and still hurt deeply. And just because you forgive doesn't mean there's not some scars on you, and there's not a way of living that's still challenging. And
Mhm,
there's that doesn't mean that I'm done forgiving. I think forgiving is a continuous process and practice. And
mhm,
there are days where it feels impossible, and then I have to just be really kind. If I can't forgive, then just be kind as much as I can to
mhm.
myself and others. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. There's so many questions, and I want to get to the questions before we run out of time.
Yeah. It's so
Um, uh, let's see. Okay, well, I'll go to the first one by Sarah Ziza. I'm curious about where you found the capacity to write about the abandonment Kathy mentions. So painful, and it began at an age that made it difficult to comprehend. When did you know it was time to approach this pain? Was writing about it more of a means to or a result of greater healing, grasp the trauma of being separated from your parents?
That's an interesting question. I think I had started the book as a book of translations. I'd never intended to write a memoir, which I think is kind of neat. If you can trick yourself, by the way, to write a kind of book that you don't intend to write, that's a really wonderful way to try and write that book. It's so that you're not aiming for something, you're sort of slant aiming, and then it happens to land on the genre of memoir. But I don't think I set out to say, oh, I really want to dig into my truths and my pain, and I want to write a memoir about it. What happened was I just translated the letters. I, a lot of the poet that I met at Columbia was Eamon Brennan, and he's the one that told me in class, if you want to be a good poet, write poetry. If you want to be a great poet, then translate. By the way, we have translation out, and we're both working on a translation of Korean poetry. But it brought me to translation, and then the translation brought me to Dami and our work together. And so I sat down and ended up translating all of my mother's letters. And originally, I wanted a book of translation of 49 letters and then a 2-page introduction for the context. And that was going to be my offering to the world. But what happened was it was sort of, I got a really broad response about it being very difficult to, to get into this story. It was difficult. And so what would have been helpful is I had to take the 2 introduction pages and expand them to 200. So the content of the story, the narrative in the memoir now was originally just 2 pages. So that's really the poet in me. It was just a epic poem, actually a really short poem of that context. And then I had to, oh gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but expand it. And right when I hit 200 pages is when, people started saying, this is a memoir, by the way. And I said, oh great, great, great. So, yeah.
I love the accidental process of poets who write prose, like poets writing prose, I think it's becoming its own genre. But it's, you know, but it's almost, because I feel like I came to that was sort of my process where you intend to write a poem or intend to write the introduction or whatever poetic project, and then you just run out of room. You're like, oh God, I have to just write a memoir or a novel or something novel like. This is from Kim Reed. Can we expect another book about your family, maybe fiction? If you were talking about a novel earlier. Uh-huh.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm interested. I'm working on a lot of prose that is probably going to be a novel, and it does have lots of autobiographical elements. And I'm really inspired by the parts that didn't make it into the memoir. The memoir was, um, it stayed really focused on subject and theme in some ways, but
Mhm.
my mother's relationship to my grandmother Kumiko is one that is still on my mind and still comes up in our conversations because my grandmother was born and raised in Japan and had thought she was Japanese until she was 19 and later had to learn Korean. And then when she moved with my mother to the States, I mean, it was just they had a really fraught relationship. My mother and her mother-in-law and their traditions. And I was telling Alex how when I was really young, my grandmother would buy Kikkoman soy sauce. My mom would get really upset and buy Chosun soy sauce. And my dad, he's quite keen on American products, so he would just, go find the thing at the whatever store And so there was a little bit of the of World War II, or sort of those dynamics happening in my home. They were constantly coming out, and I couldn't get away from them. So I want to look more into that, more into those relationships.
That Korean Japanese tension between, or the mother-in-law, the mother and mother, the daughter mother-in-laws, and also another
Yeah.
war in of itself. Um, so this is actually, you kind of already answered this, and I'm just going to kind of combine the two questions. Both of you are poets who wrote memoirs. What was it like to write in prose, especially in an autobiographical way? And the next question is, what made you transition from writing poetry to prose? Maybe that's sort of within the same vein. You could talk about that, your approach, why you transitioned from poetry to prose.
Well, I guess we did talk about Cathy. What do you think? I want to hear a little bit more about your process of poetry and prose.
This is your launch. I I don't I've answered this question. I get this question a lot. You know, I I as I was saying, it was sort of my book Minor Feelings was kind of a palimpsest of failures, where it began as poetry, and then it was like at one point I was trying to write it as a novel, and another time I was, and there were also bits of jokes from a failed experiment with stand up, and and then it just eventually turned into this book of essays, and I've said that with essays it's a very capacious form, and I sort of see it as a coalition of genres, which actually you could say that about poetry or novels or whatever. But for me, like I had to, I essays worked for me because because I haven't written a book of prose before. I was loath to kind of tackle the memoir or tackle the novel, and it was more comfortable for me to kind of do sort of these interlinked essays. So that was, so I just sort of landed upon it. And I think for me, like, if we're talking about autobiographical, it was just easier for me to write autobiographically in prose, because I was able to kind of write within a wider range of tones that I couldn't with poetry. Poetry just seemed too tight of a space in order to kind of, like, if I wanted to be sarcastic, it doesn't come off in the same way in a poem than the way it did in prose. So I just wanted to stretch out, and that's why I turned to prose. So yeah. Um,
It's the
so,
same, yeah. It's 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 similar for me. I would say it's almost like I had my poetry collection, and
mhm,
poetry collection was really the skeleton.
mhm,
It talks about the same subjects, and it's divided with very similar themes
mhm,
and sections. But the memoir was sort of the muscle. It let me add in sort of the things that I couldn't add before. And,
mhm,
and another way of thinking about it was almost like I thought when I would finish the poetry collection, I would say, "Oh, I'm done writing about this," but I wasn't. I found that these other forms they brought out parts of the subject
mhm,
that weren't brought out before. And so sometimes changing and shifting forms is really fun to see how the subject itself changes, not necessarily the form. So that was interesting for me. But I remember, Cathy, in your book, how you say that the book started as a dare. And I really love that, as a dare to yourself. And I think that might be the best way to start anything is,
mhm.
oh, let's see if I can do it, if this is true. It's a great way.
Yeah, no, and I got that from the playwright. If you know Young Jean Lee, do you know
Yep,
Young Jean Lee,
yep.
right? And of course, then and if all of you haven't seen or read Young Jean Lee's plays, I definitely recommend that you do. But I was inspired by her sort of trick, her sort of prompt every time she wrote a play. she wrote about the worst.
Yeah.
She thought of the worst idea, the worst subject to write a play about, and then she wrote a play about that
I
subject.
love that you're bringing this up because I was just reading Youngjin Lee and I read her interview where she talks about I was just trying to write the worst play possible, and then it did amazing and everybody loved it.
Mhm.
And I just thought, wow, I think it ruined me for about 2 weeks because I thought I should be writing the worst that I can write possible. And in that process, you come up with something really brilliant. And so I was rewriting quite a bit, but it's a great prompt. I love that you brought that up.
Yeah, because I guess the it's a trick because it's it's oftentimes actually the worst subject is what makes you the most uncomfortable. So it helps you write towards what makes you uncomfortable. And for me, actually, the worst subject, I guess, would be actually it would be to write about Trump. I would never write about Trump, but like, uh, but it's also I think about like a lot of times it's like these subject matters that have been you think you've written about over and over. It's been written about over and over and over again, and there's nothing more to say about it, or it's so expected of you to write about it. And so this is what I thought about when it came to like identity, right? I was like, there's nothing more I can say about identity because all of it has been just written and rewritten, and there's nothing more I could possibly add to it. And then I thought, well, is that really true? And I was thinking maybe it's not. Maybe I can. There is something I can add to the narrative. So it's a good. It's I like that idea, and I make my students uh, write the worst subject matter, think of the worst subject matter and write it. So let's go on. Let's see. How did you choose which stories to share? What were there any that you purposely left out?
Oh, that's interesting.
Mhm.
I I think I don't think I have this anymore, but one of the issues I had working with my really generous and kind editor at Tin House. But one of the problems I have is I keep cutting things. It will be
Mhm.
almost finished, and I'll say, "Oh, I'm just going to cut this chapter out. Oh, I'm just going to cut this whole scene out." And so it just kept getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And sometimes I'll say, "Oh, I'm just going to cut this version out and start over." And so I there are a lot of sort of small and big scenes that didn't make it in, but I think um, one of the scenes that they're very slight, but one of the scenes that this might be more a question behind that question that might be interesting is that one of the chapters that I was going to cut but made it into the memoir is the UCI scene when I first get there and the counselor tells me to fulfill my mathematics degree with poetry. I almost cut that whole chapter out because I thought, I think coming to poetry in that way, it was even more unbelievable in person, by the way. And then
Mhm.
to see it on the page, I just thought, this is so cheesy. Of course this would happen. But at the same time, I thought, I don't know if I want this in here. Um, but it has some of my favorite teachers and teachers that I've kept in touch with who've taught me not only to write, but they've taught me how to teach. They've taught me how to be a teacher. And so it ended up staying with a lot of coaxing. I think I was on a flight and I said, I'm going to cut this. And then my editor calls me and we're about to take off. She's just like, you have to keep this chapter. Do not cut this chapter, please. So I said, oh, okay. I trust you.
Well, I'm glad you kept it too. Um, so I'm just gonna have two more questions because we're kind of getting close to that time. I missed this question, which I think we kind of answered. Both your works touch on such universal elements as Asian Americans, Korean Americans. How do you think you were able to find these universal truths with such clarity?
Can you say that last part again? Such universal.
Oh, yeah. How do you think you were able to find these universal truths with such clarity?
I don't know why I can't hear it, just that
Oh,
universal truths.
truth, truth. Yeah, with such clarity. Truth,
Such clarity. Oh, that's
truth. Universal truths with such clarity.
there is. um, Cathy, you might know more about this, but I think there's the story. I think to me feels so singular, even as a Korean American story. Um, and by the way, when we talk about Korean American literature, it's not a monolith, right? The Korean American experience itself is so diverse. There's a spectrum even within, I'd say, that genre. And in it, I thought my story was also so singular. It was really difficult for me to place in some ways. And what was surprising was the response. The response was much more broad because having such a singular story is paradoxically, it gets to the deepest experiences of our emotions. And it's not, what I'm learning is it's not our experiences necessarily, it's the experience of our emotions that help us sort of connect to each other. And we do that a lot with when you connect histories. Different countries or cultures have these traumatic histories. And what's really helpful is being able to connect those histories together and understand what went on this side of the world, what went on in this side of the world at this time. And I think books do that too. Books are sort of their own land, and those lands have histories. And when you connect them and you connect with other people, it does something really powerful. So I see my memoir not just as singular and as itself anymore. I see it as part of this really large spectrum of stories, and, and which is part of an even larger spectrum of sort of this American literature story. So,
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's about universal is, well, first of all, it's best not to go into a book being like, I'm going to write the universal experience or what it means to be blank, but just to be really true, as singular as possible and to be truthful to that singular experience that you are writing about, your own experience. And I often found that um, I mean, maybe it was a little bit unforgiving to myself, but it was also like if I wrote something, I was going back and always questioning why I thought that or what, I would have like a platitude or an insight, and I would, and I'm like, but why did I make this assumption? Let's go, let's deeper into that. So it was more, it was not just also the kind of implotment of life, but also kind of questioning and questioning the framing of that life that helped that as well, which was not easy for me. One last question. I'm wondering if EJ has done quote unquote formal or theoretical translation study, or if it has just happened through practice.
oh, that's fun.
Mhm.
Um, I got my second degree at Columbia in literary translation, and that's really interesting because we were sort of our workshops and our classes and our reading. You get a really traditional sense of translation. And I think the traditional way of translating is sort of what you would call a seamless translation. It's a perfect translation, or it's one where the language that you translate it into reads as if it was written in that language. And it wasn't until I sort of left and met a community of other translators and other poets who are translating, I started to question that maybe there's some more of this I could revisit. And I realized, well, if languages, and Don Me talks about this a lot too, if languages have histories, and those histories are connected to each other. I mean, translation is political because if I'm translating a non-dominant, historically non-dominant Korean language into the English, when I'm aiming for a perfect translation, what am I doing to the Korean? Am I erasing it? Am I sort of pushing it back down? And so um, it's not, it's just, there's just more nuances that I became aware of what translation does and what you can do as a translator. So sometimes I mean, this wouldn't work for every single project, but with my mother's letters, I was a lot more sort of creative, more of a creative translator in that I was keeping Korean rhythms and some Korean diction. And if there was a shared assonance in a similar word, I would choose that word over what you might want a word that's very sharp and gets to the English in a straight path. I wanted sort of these zigzag paths from the original language to translated language. And I wanted to that's why in the intro I say my translations aren't, the perfect translation. They're the dreams. They're the letter streams. And I wanted it so that if you read the letters in English, they would read almost, they would read with a haunting of Korean. And it's like you're reading Korean too. I don't ever push it out of the way, but I just finished translating a book of Korean poetry by Iwon with my co-translator, Marcy Calabretta Pincio Bello. But for that, it's really interesting because the same idea and the same idea is there, but the way we go about it is different. So like, thinking of form, thinking of, what avant-garde Korean poetry looks like in the English, it's a little different. And we're working with E1 a lot too, so that helps.
That's amazing. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, EJ. Really, it was really fun talking. And and thank you all. Karen, are you?
Yes, I want to thank both of you for another wonderful evening. I've been in this business long enough to know how special it is that we have writers of your caliber, both writing your own work, your poetry, your criticism, your prose, and also your translations. I feel a little choked up about it, actually. And it's been my honor to be here with you tonight. If you are in the audience, if you've not read either of their books, I encourage you to buy them from us, give them to friends, share them. They're wonderful, wonderful books. Elliott Bay Book Company is open for in-store browsing with masks. We do limit the number of people who come in and we limit your stay. We're also doing curbside pickup and also mail order. So thank you to everyone who bought from us and everyone who attended. And if you have friends that didn't see this event, we're going to have it on our Facebook Book Live page for a while. So that'll appear shortly after we sign off tonight. And I invite you to come and revisit this. So looking forward to new books, the translations that EJ is working on and her PhD project, and many more books from both of you. And they're also great to follow on Twitter. So please follow them on Twitter and social media. So thanks so much to everyone tonight. Bye. Good night.